Today's hearing will examine competition in the U.S. airline industry and the government regulations that limit such competition. As well, we will hear from witnesses. Consumers have more choice than ever before when it comes to both domestic and international air travel. Annual passenger traffic has nearly quadrupled since the 1970s, and consumers now benefit from a range of choices, from the legacy airlines to the low-cost and ultra-low-cost carriers. That is all thanks to the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978. Prior to passage of this law, the U.S. airline industry was regulated by a government-created body known as the Civil Aeronautics Board, or CAB. The CAB heavily regulated the industry, setting restrictions on fares, routes, and entry into the market. In other words, the government played a significant role in choosing which airlines could fly, where they could fly, and what prices they could charge. This system was severely flawed and highly ineffective, and protected the existing carriers at the expense of promoting competition. Recognizing these flaws, Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act, which phased out the old system and allowed airlines to freely compete. This deregulation transformed the market into what we see today. Unshackled from government regulation, what we saw over time was intense competitive pressure that pushed prices down and consumer choice up. But that pressure also led to a significant number of mergers, acquisitions, and bankruptcies. Between 1978 and 2005, for example, 162 airlines filed for bankruptcy. Today's airline industry, while certainly more accessible and more competitive, is also more concentrated than ever before. The big four air carriers, American, United, Delta, and Southwest, control nearly 80% of domestic airline travel. And while the Airline Deregulation Act freed the airlines from the decrees of government boards, the government still occupies a major role in commercial aviation that often benefits the incumbents at the expense of new entrants. For example, at 7 of the nation's busiest airports, the Federal Aviation Administration, or the FAA, controls or distributes access to takeoffs and landings through what's known as a slot system. Slot allocations are highly sought after, particularly for new entrants. An example, at London's Heathrow, for example, a single slot allocated sold for tens of millions of dollars. But the FAA cannot auction these slots, instead distributing them largely to incumbent carriers who own them in perpetuity through what's known as the grandfather rights. Many of these slots allocations also tend to be awarded to air carriers with existing infrastructure, such as gate access. At DCA and Chicago O'Hare, for example, slot allocations heavily favor American and United, who operate main hubs. At other major airports, such as Atlanta and Dallas-Fort Worth, legacy carriers control over 70% of the existing gates. Lease agreements for these gates are often long-term and can last for decades. For example, in 2016, Delta signed a 20-year lease agreement with the City of Atlanta for its airport. That lease agreement also stipulated that the City of Atlanta could not operate a second airport. These agreements create a significant barrier to entry for competitors seeking to gain a foothold at major airports. If a competitor can't access a gate, it can't compete for a slot. Airports are also limited by government regulations that make expanding difficult. To build new runways or terminals, airports must submit environmental reviews to the FAA. This process can easily be weaponized to delay airport construction. Across the country, environmental activists file lawsuits using the National Environmental Policy Act to delay these new projects. These regulations act as a constraint, which in turn limits the airline's ability to expand and compete. Finally, like domestic ocean shipping, the United States reserved domestic air transportation only to its U.S. air carriers. This practice, known as cabotage, creates significant tension between protecting our domestic airlines and promoting competition. As these examples show, the government is still heavily involved in the airline industry. Consumers deserve a system where airlines compete freely and can innovate and grow, not a system where the government consistently puts its thumb on the scale to foreclose competition. Government-imposed barriers destroyed competition, leaving consumers worse off. The most recent example of this was the proposed Spirit-JetBlue merger. In 2023, the Biden-Harris DOJ sued to block the proposed $3.8 billion merger. The DOJ claimed the merger would remove Spirit from the market and reduce competition. At the time, the proposed merger would have created the fifth largest airline domestically with 10% market share and increased competition against the Big Four. However, 1 year later, a federal judge in Massachusetts sided with the DOJ and blocked the deal. Spirit later filed for bankruptcy twice and ultimately shut down operations in May of this year. The blocked merger of Spirit-JetBlue offers a cautionary tale about government overregulation. By blocking the transaction, regulators prevented the market from testing whether a strong competitor could emerge to challenge the industry's largest incumbents. At a minimum, the case demonstrates the importance of ensuring that antitrust enforcement promotes competition rather than merely preserving the status quo. As Congress evaluates the future of the airline industry, we should remain mindful of the lessons of deregulation. Competition, not heavy-handed regulation, has been the primary driver of lower fares, greater consumer choice, and increased innovation. In the words of the Airline Deregulation Act, the airline industry needs a maximum reliance on competitive market forces. Our goal should be to remove unnecessary barriers to entry, encourage robust competition, and ensure that consumers, not regulators, are the ultimate beneficiaries of airline policy. I look forward to today's discussion.